Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I am a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. And today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. María Elena Cepeda is professor of Latina, Latino, and Latinx studies and faculty affiliate in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and American Studies at Williams College. Celeste Wagner, a doctoral candidate at the University of Pennsylvania and an affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce María Elena in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter our series is co-sponsored by the Alex Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Radio, Television and Film, the Latina and Latino Studies program, and the program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go into the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly about how the seminar will unfold. First, Celeste will tell us more about María Elena's research and career in just a minute. María Elena will deliver her seminar. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar. Celeste will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us. And without further ado, Celeste, the screen is all yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Pablo, for the introduction and for the opportunity to moderate this talk. And also thank you to Mora Matasi and Val Grest behind the scenes for all your work coordinating this event. It is a real pleasure for me to introduce Professor María Elena Cepeda today. Dr. Cepeda is professor of Latina Latino Studies at Williams College, where she's also a faculty affiliate both at the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program and in American Studies. She holds a PhD in Spanish from the University of Michigan, where she graduated with a dissertation that received the prestigious Outstanding Latino Studies Dissertation Award from the Latin American Studies Association. Her research studies intersectional issues of race and gender in transnational Latino popular media and music, with a focus on issues of language and politics. She's the author of the book Musical Imagination, where she analyzed how popular music and the Miami music industry in particular offered a space for the imagination and enactment of Colombian identity. She has also co-edited 3 other books, including the essential contribution of the Routledge Handbook of Latino Media with Dr. Dolores Inés Casillas. Her work has also been published in numerous peer-reviewed journals, and just to name a few, Communication, Culture and Critique, Latino Studies, or the Women's Studies Quarterly. She also has an outstanding career as a teacher and mentor. Some of her courses that I personally would have loved to have taken are Comparative Perspectives on Transnationalism and Difference, or Analyzing Mediated Difference in Media Studies. She is currently working on a book project titled Never a Local: Migration, Gender, Media, Madness. I am sure we will all be looking forward to its publication. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Professor Cepeda, who will be presenting her talk titled Loca Epistemologies, Reframing Gendered Madness on the Locatora radio podcast.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to Pablo, Mora, and all those working on the administrative end for their thoughtful, effective organization of this event and this series. Thank you as well to all of you who are joining us in the audience today. I appreciate the opportunity to learn together. And I also want to thank María Celeste for her kind introduction. I still get very anxious before public speaking, even after all of these years. And that introduction made me feel better. So gracias, María Celeste. Just a quick vision image description for all of you out there. I know you can't see me right now. We're having some tech issues. But I am a middle-aged, light-skinned Latina with long, wavy, dark hair. I'm wearing red glasses, a multicolored blouse, and I clearly like gold jewelry. So that's what's going on there. I also wanted to start, before I start talking, I wanted to give a shout out to a University of Illinois, Chicago professor, Elena Gutierrez, who was the colleague and friend who first mentioned the Locatora podcast to me some years ago. So I appreciate that. Today, I'm going to be delving into a few paragraphs on the Radio Locatora podcast that I recently published in a piece that offered a Latina feminist perspective on mental disability, time, and the neoliberal academy in the South Atlantic Quarterly's Spring 2021 special issue on crip temporalities, which was co-edited by Elizabeth Freeman and Ellen Samuels. So I'm going to be building on those two short paragraphs that I wrote. I'll be extending my analysis using the Locatora radio podcast as a key example of the ways in which some Latinx creators are employing digital technology to actively reframe our understandings of the power dynamics at play at the intersection of gendered madness or mental disability, violence, and Latina or Latinx identities. So I'm going to talk about two main topics today. I'm going to keep it simple. First, I'll be talking about the reworking of gendered madness that takes place in the podcast, particularly at the level of discourse or language. I'm also going to be talking about the ways in which temporality or time shapes the podcast and our experience of it. It's an experience that I'm calling the analog in the digital. And this irregular temporality that I would ascribe or attribute to the podcast really is in keeping with its concentration or focus on supporting survivors. And so they do that in their own way, and I'll explain that in a bit. I'm bringing several fields into conversation here: media studies, Latinx studies, disability studies, and gender studies. This is a rarity, and it's part of the intervention that I'm trying to make today and in my larger book project. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to screen share with you. I think I can. So, as you can see, this PowerPoint is very much in keeping with the aesthetic of Locatora Radio. As you're going to see, this first slide is one of the stock images or logos that get used with the podcast. You can see the radio microphone, the manicured hand, the roses. So the methodological approach, I mean, this is another logo from Locatora Radio. This is probably the most famous logo attached to the program. So the methodological approach that I use in this project is called critical autoethnography. And I'm very much inspired by the scholarship of women of color communications and media studies scholars like Robin M. Boylorn, Jessica Garcia Hernandez, Aisha Durham, among others. And critical autoethnography is actually a form of cultural analysis realized via personal narrative that permits critique at the individual as well as the cultural levels. Without attempting to speak for others, critical autoethnography mindfully positions the researcher as research subject, permitting the marginalized, drawing from lived experience, to articulate their own realities, and ultimately engender further storytelling. Initially legitimized by feminist scholars who employed their personal experiences and social positionalities as a critical data set, critical autoethnography constitutes a point of departure from which to engage in broader social critiques. So traditionally, writing pertaining to the emotions, lived experience, and practiced vulnerability, as we might call it, has been framed as a stereotypically feminine endeavor, and in turn has been perceived as inferior, if not a wholesale impediment, to the superior forces of objectivity, rationality, and ultimately masculinity. It is important, however, that we do not cast these practices as simply feminine, as they are just as often feminist, given their facility for elucidating the everyday linkages between the personal and the political. Critical ethnography, and this is an important quote, prompts self-interrogation and cultural accountability by attending to live experience and as epistemology and critical inquiry. Critical ethnography, autoethnography, shifts the gaze of as other towards cultural constructs, social circumstances, and oppressive inequalities to examine our lives as lived while critiquing and dismantling the contexts that bind us. So critical autoethnography really constitutes a form of embodied knowledge that offers us a method for examining the everyday interplay of culture and power. It really privileges lived experience and the inherent messiness of human existence. And it also embraces the everyday. And in that sense, I would argue that it's a particularly effective tool for this thematic exploration of popular culture and media, given that they are so grounded in the everyday. And I just want to say, one of my colleagues remarked to me recently, my colleague, Puerto Rican cultural critic, Alberto Sandoval Sanchez, whose work many of you might know, he observed to me recently that he said to me, "Hey, María Elena, all research is autobiographical." And I think he's absolutely right. That really stuck with me. This is a very autobiographical project for me. So I guess I'll just start off by positioning myself as a researcher further by stating that I am someone who does self-identify as a loca. I have not only been called one, but I've been treated like a loca my entire life. Many times I have been dismissed as a loca by people whose understanding of the term was very limited and grounded in patriarchy. To be a loca, as the host of Radio Locatora assert, is oftentimes to also be a survivor of gendered violence. So I present this research to you as well in my capacity as a survivor. And that's how I'm reading it. So I want to start off after that little introduction and start off talking about podcasting, and who's listening at this moment, and where do Latinx audiences fall in the podcasting landscape? So who's listening to podcasting? As of 2021, 62% of the US population 12 years and older, or about 176 million people, were weekly online audio listeners. This is an all-time high. As of 2021, approximately 80 million Americans, or 28% of the population over 12, are now weekly podcast listeners. This is a 17% increase over 2020. 25% of the US Latinx population are monthly podcast listeners as of 2020. 55% of US Latinx podcasters are male. I'm getting a lot of this data from the Infinite Dial survey in 2021 and the Edison Research survey. This is the most recent data I can find. And what you're seeing here is, yes, there is an increase in Latinx listeners for podcasts, but it's still a very white, Anglo, male-dominated sort of soundscape, right? And there is a lot of room. There is a need for more Latina-centered content. One recent podcast, actually, one of Zoe Muñoz, one of the hosts of the program, who I'll talk about in a moment, notes the increase in Latinx podcast listeners since the pandemic broke out in 2020. It's actually been a 52% increase. And she frames this as part of a long tradition of Latinx audiences being avid consumers of sound media like radio and music. So you can see, right, there's podcasting is something where there's a lot of interest right now. And people are, I think it's noteworthy the way in which these two hosts, and again, I'm going to introduce them in a second, talk about podcasts, are so aware of what's going on in the podcast world in terms of numbers listening, and also numbers listening, race, gender, And they actually see their podcast, and again, this is noteworthy and very indicative of the mindset with which they're approaching the whole project. They see their podcast as, quote, a gateway to a multitude of social justice oriented projects and solutions, end quote. So, right, that's sort of like the political orientation that they're approaching their podcasting with. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what is Radio Locatora and who are the individuals behind what has grown from a single podcast into an actual production company within the last 5 years or so. So the hosts of Radio Locatora are Ariana Rodriguez, also known as Diosa Femme, and Zoe Muñoz, also known as Mala Muñoz. The show is Los Angeles based since 2016, pardon me. Currently, there are 119 capítulos. They call them capítulos or episodes. So it's a well-established podcast. And they are produced by Locatora Productions, which was established in 2021. More on this later. The hosts self-identify as millennials, and like many millennials, their relationship started online. They were Twitter and Instagram friends for years. They eventually met in real life. And within a year, Ariana Rodriguez was texting Zoe Muñoz and asking her if she was interested in doing a podcast together. So that's kind of how they got started. I'll talk to you a little bit about the individual hosts because they're very interesting individuals. So Ariana Rodriguez, also known as Diosa Femme, is a 2015 graduate of UC Santa Barbara in literature and creative writing. Is formally trained in the humanities. Both of the hosts are, and this comes across. Ariana Rodriguez has an activist background, has work experience with the LA disabled community, and is an accomplished published writer, and also had a social media presence pre-Locatora Radio. I actually became aware of Ariana Rodriguez through her YouTube video, her Femme Power Femme Power Makeup tutorial on YouTube has actually been written and published about in Feminist Media Studies. If you're interested in seeing that, look at the Women's Studies Quarterly Spring 2018 issue, and there's an article by Michelle White talking about that video. So this whole notion of radical self-care and femme and women of color empowerment and identity are key themes that run through Ariana Rodriguez's creative work. Right, very obvious. And also there's always a concern with personal aesthetics. I think both of the hosts are interested in personal aesthetics, and that becomes part of sort of like the fabric of the show, right? This particular aesthetic. Why the name Diosa Femme? I want to focus a bit on these the names, the sort of like these alternative names that the hosts use, because they are very intentional and not in a slick sort of insincere way. They're actually quite rich in symbolism and carry multiple meanings. Right, so Diosa Femme has, as Ariana has talked about, Diosa Femme is sort of a name that recognizes the divine feminine in herself, coming from a place of healing and love, gentleness. Diosa is also a name that acknowledges that she is a sexual, sensual being, right? It's a really holistic perspective on selfhood and identity that comes across even in that early YouTube video that I mentioned, which is from 2016, I should mention, right? And one last thing, Ariana Rodriguez is Peruvian and Mexican, which is an interesting fact. And I'm interested in exploring that further and how it comes into play within the dynamics of the podcast. So Zoe Muñoz, also known as Mala, is a 2014 graduate of Tufts University in American Studies, and it shows. Most of the podcast listeners are familiar with the fact that Mala worked for some time as an on-call rape crisis counselor in Los Angeles, and that's an experience that has deeply informed the focus and direction of Locatora Radio. Zoe Muñoz is also an accomplished writer, has worked in the education system in Los Angeles, has also worked teaching self-defense. Why the name Mala? Zoe Muñoz explains that she has always been drawn to the notion of embracing the shunned woman, the stigmatized woman, the malas of the world, in her words, those who are scorned for their sexuality and sex. And growing up as a third generation Chicana in a Catholic home, Mala rejected traditional ways of conceptualizing women. For Zoe Muñoz, a mala is also a loud bitch who speaks her mind, calls others out, and possibly makes them look bad. So, right, la mala thus is pointing out the bad in others, right? And thus, I think, the threat. As I'll unpack a bit more shortly, Mala argues that mala and loca are parallel terms that do much of the same stigmatizing work. So what is Radio Locura? For time's sake today, I'm going to focus on the media format that started the production, that started it all, the Locatora radio podcast, which is still the flagship content of the production company that they launched in spring 2021. But they have a constellation of projects and they're very active on social media. You can find them, and I'll give you information about where to find them at the end of this presentation. So Mala describes the podcast that she and Diosa Femme produce as, quote, shooting the shit and chatting. And really, there is an intimate feel to each episode, or what they call capítulo of the podcast. It's a reflection of the close relationship between the hosts, the mutual respect between the hosts and the podcast guests, the often taboo or highly personal nature of many of the conversational topics, and really, quite frankly, the fact that they're speaking right into your ear, right? On a regular basis, you come to know these people, or know in quotes, right? So the mission of Radio Locatora, or the tagline that they often use, and this is an evolving tagline, is they describe the podcast as, quote, a radiophonic novela archiving the brilliance and legacy of women and femmes of color. Right, note the intentionality of the language, and I'm highlighting the word archiving for a reason, and I'll get to that. One of the main focuses of the podcast is feminist education that is femme and women of color centered, in which the hosts introduce listeners to artists, activists, political issues, public health information, including information about mental health, sexual wellness topics, personal aesthetics, and self-defense. These are all regular topics on the podcast. Diosa Femme describes the podcast as a knowledge share dedicated to helping Latinx listeners. And the hosts also characterize Radio Locatora as an indie project that has kind of grown into a business unexpectedly, right? I think intention is a really apt word to use to describe the podcast. There's a sincerity and intentionality about it that shine through. These are mujeres who understand the power of discourse, of media, of sound, of imagery. They deploy them all quite skillfully, constantly producing, invoking narratives, and then producing a counter narrative. One thing that I'd like to talk about as well, before I start talking about loca epistemology specifically, and this is a production level, this is sort of like a set of production level issues about the podcast that I'd like to talk about. I'm kind of loath to talk about representation without talking about at least production a little bit, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the role of DIY as central to Locatora Radio's political and artistic commitments. Radio Locatora has always expressed a commitment to remaining indie, particularly given their desire to retain control over their intellectual property, which does not always happen for independent podcast creators who later become attached to larger podcast production companies. For the hosts, remaining independent and self-financing has also meant carrying out all of the podcast production and distribution tasks themselves, despite lacking any formal training in journalism, communications, media studies, or media production. And this is something that they regularly note on the podcast. They own the glitches, the occasional poor audio, and they actually often become part of poor audio, or these glitches often become part of the sonic texture of the podcast. And this occurs even from the first capítulo on, right? In that very first capítulo, which incidentally is called Loca Epistemologies, we can clearly hear the sound of Mala's dog Taquito whining in the background. In another episode that Elba Obregon, who wrote an honors thesis about Radio Locatora at Williams College last year, Elba Obregon notes how you can hear a car roaring past. And that's just a reminder, right, that the podcast that we're listening to is concretely rooted in the midst of an urban center, in this case, Los Angeles, right? And this sonic texture really speaks to the multiple hats that Diosa and Mala must wear, as is, as is so often required of most women and femmes of color in the everyday context. And this also harks back to a long history of Latinx creatives employing a rascuache approach to media production and creative work in general. It reminds us of the resourcefulness and ingenuity of the mujeres and casts them not as podcast producers lacking formal training, but rather as active, agentive participants in the digital sphere. Elba Obregón observes that Mala and Diosa acknowledge that they, like many Latinxes in US society, are navigating systems and structures that are unfamiliar and not designed with them in mind. So I would suggest that we understand the DIY character of Radio Locatora not as a deficit, but rather as a reflection of the everyday material circumstances that are currently defining the conditions of production. So now I'm going to get to what Diosa and Mala refer to on the podcast as the carne, or the meat of my presentation, a discussion of gender locura on the podcast, and a consideration of some of its temporal features and their impacts. I'd like to state, though, from the onset that the complex dynamics of loca identities and the ways in which we enshrine them in discourse have been fruitfully studied by others, particularly Latina feminist scholars and queer and trans Latinx scholars. For example, Larry LaFontaine-Stokes' recent book, Trans Locas, really gets at the long-standing tensions around the term, its usages, the ways it has been embraced, and the ways in which it is embraced, as well as rejected by the trans, queer, and feminist Latinx communities, both in and outside of the academy. I'm also thinking about Laura Alperin's literary study of Latinas and harm, intersections of harm, and its engagement with pain, trauma, and gender Latinidad as another important site of theorizing loca identity. And of course, these aren't the only case studies. I'm also thinking, for example, about Jessica Pavón Colón's book, Graffiti Girls, right? That examines this whole notion of the loca and how it's a contested term. I just wanted to emphasize, give you a brief overview and emphasize some of the touchstones that have been guiding me as I begin my research. So, there are a lot of discursive nods to the centrality of loca identities in the podcast, right? The idea of Radio Locatora to start with, right? It's kind of a play, Radio Locatora, and then the notion of a locatora, which hails back to the idea of a locutora, the traditional term. Locutor, locutora, the traditional term for somebody who, as I've heard earlier in an earlier seminar, is a great term, a great way to sort of like define a locutor or locutora is somebody who's in command of the airspace, right? But we're seeing here on Radio Locatora that the locas are in charge. They're the ones in command of the airspace, right? The podcasters often refer to themselves as just a couple of locas on the radio. They call their fans and listeners locamores. Their Q&A segment on Instagram Live, and they do sometimes in the podcast, is called Oye Loca, and the locas are them, Mala and Diosa. On their website, you go and you can shop Loquita and get merch, right? Loca merch. So you can see here how the podcast conversation really becomes a site in which language is deployed to acknowledge existing narratives, then invokes them in a way that flips them on their heads so that we might, in Diosa's words, quote, consider matters from a woman's perspective, end quote. Right? And impressed about the pod, and even it surfaces impressed about the podcast, right? The language of gender locura, or of locura in general, right? For example, in an early Forbes piece about Radio Locura, Diosa expresses the desire for Radio Locatora to function as a survivor-centered space where artists and creators can express their locuras. Right. So there's a thoughtfulness around language that is woven into the foundation of the podcast and Locatora productions in general. And it really does make sense given the mujeres' professional creative lives and their educational lives outside of the podcast. So to fully grasp the significance and mission of Radio Locatora, you really have to understand that its underlying epistemologies, or the foundational ways of knowing that inform Mala and Diosa's central approaches and philosophies, are guided by the experiences of being Latinas locas, or of being survivors. Indeed, the very first capítulo, as I just mentioned, is entitled Loca Epistemologies, a term that resurfaces in one additional capítulo at the very first capítulo, capítulo number 28, right? And it also resurfaces in several of the capítulo descriptions, right, throughout these 119 capítulos that are already in existence. And often at the beginning of a new temporada or season, right, of Radio Locatora, the hosts will get together and sort of have another conversation about where Loca Epistemologies is right now and how they're understanding the term. So they intentionally bring us back to the podcast's beginnings, its political and cultural underpinnings on a regular basis. They do not forget. And for me, this is an enactment of survivor allyship that is grounded in reclamation and contestation. So I really want for you to get a chance to hear these two women speaking. So I am going to play you a little bit of audio from Capítulo 28, Loca Epistemologies, Part 2. So this is basically Mala and Diosa talking about who is a loca? What is a loca? How do they understand the term at this particular moment in time? So it's about 1 minute and 10 seconds. So that was basically, that was a short bit that gave you a sense of how they're defining loca, right? And this understanding of loca, which is intrinsically linked to also this notion of being a survivor, right? As Mala stated in an earlier 2017 capítulo entitled Love Letter to Chillonas, loca is also reclaimed for Latina and Latinx survivors in an effort to contest the notion that survivors are hysterical. As she states, and I like this quote, "We are not crazy. We are exposing shit that we don't like." So I wanted to move on and give you a better feel for what critical autoethnography sounds like. So I'm going to read you a short passage from the little bit of writing that I've done on Radio Locatora to give you a feel for the methodology. So, for those in the Spanish-speaking world, apodo means nickname. In Latinx communities, nicknames are assigned to virtually everyone, ostensibly as a sign of affection. For much of my life, loca, in its most innocuous iteration, Spanish for crazy woman or girl, or the diminutive loquita, have been apodos, both before and after my formal psychiatric history began around 20 years of age, and amongst those who were previously familiar with that history or not. As host Mala Muñoz and Diosa Femme note in the inaugural episode of the popular Latinx feminist podcast, Radio Locatora, in the Latinx context, loca actually signs in for more than the less favorable alternative translation of crazy bitch suggests. In their discussion of loca epistemologies, the hosts acknowledge the historical roots of loca ways of knowing, linking the loca to the Catholic concept of Marianismo, or the Madonna whore complex. While the loca is understood within the context of Marianismo as traditionally tied to the role of the whore in hypersexuality, Muñoz and Diosa Femme reclaim the term, informing listeners that a loca may also be understood as that woman who just doesn't give a fuck, the girl who dares to live her life differently than the women in her family who came before her, or the survivor of domestic or sexual violence who is not believed. For example, La Malinche and La Llorona are but two of the famous locas who populate Chicanx and Latinx popular culture as survivors of racism and heteropatriarchy, whose experiences go unvalidated. The loca trope is thus a size of discursive historical violence that both Mala Muñoz and Diosa Femme ultimately connect to the stigma of mental disability and its impacts on their own lives. Perhaps most significantly, a loca is primarily understood by Mala Muñoz and Diosa Femme as any woman who does not conform to societal expectations. While I eagerly claim my positionality as a loca as it pertains to mental disability and my identity as a survivor of gendered violence, I place equal emphasis on my own inability, in concert with a lack of willingness, to adhere to Latinx and specifically Colombian diasporic norms, or my own connection to what US Colombian writer Patricia Engel refers to as the condition of being a failed Colombiana. As Catalina Esquerra contends, Failing as a Colombiana indexes multiple deficiencies. It references the failure to maintain upward socioeconomic mobility and the simultaneous failure to perform compulsory heterosexuality, among other things, right? So this is the kind of mess I want to say that is, as the hosts would say on the podcast, this is the kind of mess that is loca making, right? Okay, I want to show you some of these images because they're really beautiful. So, discourse. There's a lot of coded language and not so coded language that gets cited in the podcasts. Right? Calling themselves podcasteras peligrosas, which I love. The hosts emphasize topics that are generally taboo within the Latinx community or that are addressed only in coded, often gendered language, like loca, obviously, traviesa, diabla, malcriada, sinvergüenza, bandolera, bandida, mala, a lot of this in music and popular culture, right, in film. This is often language used to disparage women who don't do what men want, even when it's not in their own best interest, or who dare to enjoy casual sex. So this is a really rich vocabulary and it's numerous. I sat down and this was like a 10-second sort of me regurgitating words, and it was very easy to come up with these terms, right? Because they're so important in Spanish and within Latinx culture, right? They're of great import to any consideration of patriarchal power and how it works, right? There's a real societal and cultural investment in disciplining gendered subjects through discourse. Right? In their discussion in a capítulo called La Diabla, which is number 55, they discuss these terms used to frame Latinas and their prevalence in Latin American and Latinx media and popular culture. In fact, they argue that a lot of these terms actually, you see them get used in novelas, right? They argue that a discussion of novelas is intimately linked to loca epistemologies. And I'm going to get back to this whole reliance on novelas, right? They discuss their commitment to counter-narrative and clarify that loca epistemologies are in fact grounded in counter-narratives and the dissection of tropes. Mala and Diosa and their guests thus harness the power of traditional Latinx discourse around gendered madness and turn it on its head, bending the existing lexicon and resemanticizing it or imbuing it with new meanings in order to recenter the everyday experiences and perspectives of survivors. And I want to give you a great example, the word loca making. It's a verb, and it's purposefully a verb. It's a verb that emphasizes the active, systematic ways in which survivors are frequently invalidated and silenced. And you can see when it's loca making, right? The loca is somebody who's made. And you see with that language that it's not the individual survivor, but rather a complex web of interlocking systems that is to blame for the gendered violence in question. So the emphasis on discourse as a critical site for contesting heteropatriarchy and reimagining the present and future as places where women and femmes of color survivors are believed and supported, and where women and femmes of color who do not adhere to dominant social norms are not pathologized. However, as central as it may be to the same loca epistemologies, as central as language is to loca epistemologies, that's not the whole story, right? As the Locatora radio hosts affirm, right, loca epistemologies is more than rhetoric, which to me really feels like a way of saying that loca epistemologies include but are not limited to verbal or written discourse. That loca epistemologies also encompass that which is experienced and expressed beyond language. This is significant given what we know about survivors of violence and abuse, and that traumatic memories and experiences live on in the body, if not clearly in the mind. So loca epistemologies, while being strongly rooted in a particular discursive sensibility, can also account for the experiences of survivors that so often extend beyond language and that are instead present in the body and in the knowing that the body retains. It is important to the hosts that loca ways of knowing, that loca experiences, loca perspectives, and loca brilliance be recorded and archived. Indeed, the archival mission of Radio Locatora is a survivor-centered loca epistemology in practice. What I mean by this is to say that by centering and recording loca experiences, loca perspectives, and loca brilliance for media audiences, Radio Locatora is subverting the tendency in US society to treat trauma survivors, quote, as members of society whose problems represent the memory of suffering, rage, and pain in a world that longs to forget. And I would also add, this is a society that does not wish to acknowledge its own complicity in that suffering, rage, and pain. It's an engagement here with memory that is also obviously an engagement with temporality. An issue that I would like to discuss next, but I'm concerned about time. All right, I'll wrap up here in the next like 2 to 3 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes, I think. Those of us working in digital media must invest ourselves in at least some base level consideration of temporality, I would argue, given that digital technologies one of its foundational contributions, I think is sort of, or not one of its contributions, but I would say one of its impacts has been this shift in our understanding of time and the ways in which we experience time, right? Time-space compression, which has been shaping our existence for some time now. Radio Locatora exhibits a temporality that distinguishes it from many podcasts. Dolores Inés Casilla made a comment to me recently about how Radio Locatora isn't like Anglo podcasts, right? In the sense that it doesn't adhere to a regular schedule per se. Capítulos aren't always of a standard length. And that got me thinking, right? And so I was thinking, what is this irregular temporality? How could we understand it? And I don't mean to, and this is not, I'm not critiquing it. I'm trying to understand it because I think it is important. So, this is all a reminder that this is still a DIY indie outfit run by 2 mujeres who are on demand with multiple projects, very full lives, who are also trying to manage fundraising and a presence on Patreon, as well as on Twitter, Instagram, right? All the social media platforms. There's also a way in which we can read this irregular temporality as a form of resistance to the ways in which capitalism utilizes time as a means of disciplining workers, and indeed all of us, right? This is very much a question that is come forth more than ever in the pandemic era, as many of us are continuing to question our relationship to time and labor. And I'm also going to suggest then that we might think about this irregular temporality as an act of self-care, which I don't think would be out of character. So, the podcast really encourages various temporal engagements, past, present, alternative, and future, in terms of its themes as well as its practices. And by its practices, I'm referring most specifically to its commitment to archiving, to archival work, which I see as an investment in the future of digital media and a practice, digital Latinx feminist media, and a practice that enables an intersectional feminist genealogy to be created. So I'm going to start wrapping up here, but I really just wanted to say there are so many ways in which this novela is playing, this radiophonic novela, and that's what they call it, a radiophonic novela, right? And you can see here how the importance of radio and the influence, the historic relationship of Latinx listeners to radio is also part of this show. Radio is part of the visual iconography of the podcast. They're constantly talking about novelas, and they're talking about telenovelas, but I also think we can talk in terms of radionovelas here. So Latin American film, telenovelas, radionovelas are all influences, and in a way it's sort of like dragging the analog into the digital, right? And I can talk more about this later. I'm happy to. I don't really have time to go over this piece. And again, you can see here how this podcast, like ethnic media, and particularly like Spanish language radio, as many scholars like Mónica de la Torre, Christopher Chavez, Mari Castañeda, Dolores Inés Casillas, as they've shown us, right, radio has a long-standing platform for Latinx public advocacy. And I think the Radio Locatora podcast is part of that tradition. And I can talk to you a little bit more about what's happened with Radio Locatora recently, since they've professionalized in the last few years and launched their own podcasting company. And they're, again, very exquisitely aware of what's going on in the podcasting universe right now. They have podcasts about podcasts, which is always interesting. So Mana and Diosa frequently joke on the podcast about how the label radiophonic novela is merely a very extra way of labeling something that is, as they often say in unison, just a podcast. I would argue, however, that what Radio Locatora and its hosts offer is something far more complex and meaningful than the phrase just a podcast suggests. They offer all of us, and women and femme of color survivors most definitively, an accessible alternative language for dismantling the everyday expressions of heteropatriarchy and ableism embedded in the traditional Latinx discourse of gendered madness. Moreover, the world of Locatora productions, and specifically the heavy inspiration that it draws from legacy media, such as radio, film, and television, underscores the ongoing relevance of quote unquote old media within new or digital media, or what I'm calling here the analog within the digital. This look towards what we tend to think of as the media past occurs again in a tandem with a market concern for the future of podcasting and digital media. You see this in their short sci-fi film that they produced in 2020 called Loquitas Anonymous. Look it up on YouTube, it's fabulous. It's an alternative future that they're mapping out, right, for women and femmes of color in that short video. And you can see here just in the podcast and all of their work, a real commitment to recording and archiving the experiences, creativity, and brilliance of women and femmes of color, of survivors for the archive. So I'm going to end my remarks now. Thank you so much for listening. And I look forward to your questions. Oh, before I end, really important. My information in case you'd like to contact me, but even more important, this is how you can support Locatora Radio. If you want to support Latinx digital media, support Latinx feminist media, these are the ways that you can find Locatora Radio. You can donate. They're on Patreon. You can support them that way. I think it's really important that those of us who are, scholars in this field, we also, engage the materials that we study in this way, right? So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Cepeda, for this just wonderful and brave talk. I really enjoyed all of it, and I have many questions about different things, and I will, sorry, my screen was not showing. I would like to start by asking you something, but I know that there are already questions of the public, so I will just try to be brief and ask you something about this idea of the loca standpoint, this epistemological standpoint that you are analyzing, and I think it's much needed, this view on reclamation and contestation of the loca, the survivor, which really fights against most mainstream in news media, in entertainment media, in lots of popular culture, the notion of the survivor as passive and as broken. And I think it's much needed in many ways, also for media representations. But I'm wondering, how do you think that this epistemology should impact the way that scholars do research on gender-based violence? Do you think that this should impact, or how should it impact issues of, axiology, or how we as researchers relate to subjects or to objects of study, the questions that we ask, the methods that we use? How do you think that this epistemology can impact the research that we do?
That's a great question. Thank you, Maria Celeste. I think for me, you have to kind of start from the presupposition that gendered violence is everywhere. Sometimes it's very subtle, but it's an everyday practice. It's part of the world that we as Latinas and Latinxes get socialized into. And so I think understanding that is very important, and that the violence occurs not only at the level of sort of like the physical or the sexual, but also the symbolic. And we need to attend to sort of all facets of that violence. And another thing is, I think it's important that a lot of these projects and, this research and these projects and the voices that come through are the voices of survivors. Right? I think that's very important, that because so often survivors, we have our stories told for us. And often it's not only that we have our stories told for us, is that we are silenced, period. So I think it's really important to sort of sit back and listen and kind of lead with the assumption that it's everywhere, right? And that we are socialized into a world that is just rife with gender violence. And that also that it's really important that survivors be the ones leading and speaking as much as possible, right?
Yeah, thank you for that. I absolutely agree. I will read some of the questions of the audience here that are great. I hope that we have time for all of them. I will start with Valkyria Ramos' question that says, I was wondering if your research has traced how Radio Locatora's discourse has connected their loca identities with ableism, and if this space has engaged in cross-disability solidarity, since these are some themes that I'm interested in.
That is a great question. You know, I haven't noticed, I haven't listened to all 119 capítulos, but I've been listening to sort of like this discussion. I've been listening for discussion sort of ableism and more overt discussion, but it's like they're constantly critiquing ableism and dismantling it, contesting it, maybe not using certain types of language, maybe that those of us who work in disability studies or in the disabled community would use, but it's still there. There's a sensitivity to it. There's an awareness of it. But I haven't heard in the capítulos that I've listened to sort of like an overt engagement with ableism.
Thank you. And now I'm going to summarize two questions from Nicole Cunningham Frisbee. One is a question about, is locura or loca different from chingona, or are these two terms parallel in the radical work being done in reframing discourse? And then another question from her on how are if you know the archival goals and the future plans of this podcast of in the future, or if there's a timeline of when they're concluding. That's something that I'm guessing maybe you're not aware of, but yes, in terms of like, what do you think about the role of archiving this discourse, these podcasts?
I think that is one of the most critical things that I'll answer the loca chingona and then I'll get to the archiving. These are great questions. All right, loca chingona, those are overlapping terms. And I think some people see them as sort of overlap. They're not exactly the same thing. Chingona, right, is very specific to Mexican Chicana culture. And is for me a term of endearment, a wonderful sort of like empowered, powerful, fierce woman or femme, right? And look, so it does overlap with loca, but they're not quite the same thing, right? For those who are listening. As far as their archival work, I think that is the most fabulous, stellar things that they are doing. If there is a real need for people to be archiving Latinx, Latina feminist media material. There's a real need for it. If you look at Angara Valdivia's latest book, The Gender of Latinidad, she has an amazing chapter in there in which she sort of like does this really meticulous archival work with all these Latina celebrities. And it's this feminist, labor of love to read it. And you see the importance of what it is to recover all of the bits of Rita Moreno's career, all the bits of Sofia Vergara's career, and sort of map what these women have done. And you see that they've done tremendous things, and you get that perspective. And their sort of their longevity and just the labor that they've done to get where they are. You can appreciate that when somebody archives their work, right? And then it's there for the next person to study and move on. So yeah, that archival, that is a political act. It's a feminist political act that I'm just in awe of, and I hope continues. I hope they never drop that piece of their mission.
Thank you. I know we're on time, but we'll just go over just a couple of the last questions. One, I want to highlight that we're really honored with the presence of Mala here, like the creator mind, one of the minds behind this. So that's great. And thank you for that. And I just posted the question from her. That's actually a recommendation of listening to one episode that talks about ableism and disability that I think that's great. So thank you so much for sharing that. And
thank you. I really appreciate that too.
yes. And then one question that is thinking about the use of loca as a resistance to the pathologizing discourse that you've been describing and dismissing anyone who goes outside of the norm. How do you think this use of loca connects to a temporality of trauma, survivors, especially as it is related to PTSD or depression? And ways that alternative ways of being are pathologized by the medical system as well. So this is from Julia Blake. So thank you for that question as well.
Yeah, Julia, thank you. Hi, Julia, thank you for that question. That's a wonderful question. I absolutely agree with you. There's a connection. There's a connection there to be made between this temporality and particularly the temporality of PTSD. And this is something that I'm interested, that I'm starting to write about. I've done a little bit of writing about it, but it's something that I've been taking notes on in my own experience, sort of like with the temporality of PTSD and loca identity. Yes, and the ways in which sort of like the default tendency is to be dismissed, even within the medical system, right, by the medical community. I think I can only think of one time where I've actually had a doctor look at me and say, sit me down and say, and it was a female doctor, say to me, you know, I believe you. So, I mean, and I think my experience is probably pretty typical. Yeah, I don't know. Julia, I would love to talk more about that because I think you're absolutely making a very important connection there between this temporality, like loca identity, the temporality of PTSD, and sort of like this, it's hard for me to articulate. And I want to tell you, like, it's hard for me to articulate almost an answer to that question because it requires, because a lot of these temporal issues around memory and trauma are so difficult to articulate because so much of it lives in your body, and it becomes actually quite difficult to articulate. So that's something I'm working on, and I appreciate your comment.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm just going to read one last question. And I also want to say that I think that it has been very poetic that your screen has been blanked. It's almost as if we were in your podcast, you know, we're connecting with your voice. But I'm sorry that we were not able to see you. So I would just like to read one last question on, can you say something more a bit about the importance of their personal aesthetics? And I invite everyone to go to their website and see that, because it's really beautiful, everything they do and who they are, and their presentation of self. And how do you think that may be connected also to loca epistemologies?
Well, I think their aesthetic, I would characterize their aesthetic as unapologetically femme. Just like very, it's gorgeous. I would really encourage you to go to their website, check out the aesthetic. It's something that's very careful. It's thought through. Again, unapologetically femme and unapologetically loca, right? It's very, as they always use the word extra, and it is very extra, right? It's intricate. It's a lot of pink. It's beautiful. So go look at it. But I do think it is part of that. It's part of this idea that personal style can be an extension of one's politics or an expression of one's politics. I think that's what I would say with regard to their personal aesthetics. But it's definitely an issue that I want to think through some more.
Thank you so much, Maria Elena, for this very important and seminar, very courageous, very intellectually innovative, and as Celeste said, also, I'm sorry again for the technical troubles, but it actually probably has been very poetic to just have you with voice rather than with video. I want to thank our audience for great questions and for staying with us to the end. I want to thank Celeste for handling moderation as usual masterfully, and invite everybody to join us for the next seminar this coming Thursday, that is in a week, of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you very much again, Celeste and Maria Elena.